We've recently launched our appeal for the survivors of the devastating earthquake and tsunami that hit the Indonesian island of Sulawesi. Since we launched our appeal, we've had a number of inquiries from our supporters, and so today I'm joined by a number of colleagues from across the DEC and its members to help me answer some of your questions. I'm joined today by Tamara from Save the Children, Monica from the DEC itself, and Razmi from Plan International. So, Razmi, you've been talking to your colleagues on the ground in Sulawesi. So set the scene for us and tell us just how bad it is there.
Our head of disasters for the Asia region is actually based out of Jakarta. So when the disaster struck, she mobilised an emergency response team and they were able to get out to Sulawesi over a week ago. It's obviously had detrimental and devastating impact, and things are clearly starting to sort out, but it's been chaos for the first few weeks. So yeah, they are now, actually, we're happy to report we're distributing hygiene and shelter kits, 1,000 hygiene and 1,000 shelter kits, and we've set up sort of child-friendly spaces and really starting to mobilise the response there, and we're able to do it because we have a presence on the ground. But yeah, it's only the beginning, and there's a long way to go. I
know, I mean, even today I heard that the area was hit again in Java by an earthquake, so there's a lot of movement and difficulties going on in the area that can set things back. But first I thought today is International Day of the Girl, and you know, as you see with a natural disaster, obviously the tsunami came, the earthquake happened, the tsunami came in. It's indiscriminate in whether it affects men and boys or women and girls. But I really wanted to unpick with you, Tamara, whether women and girls are affected differently by natural disasters to how men and boys are affected.
They really are. We know, for example, from research that natural disasters cause more deaths in females and girls, and this has no physical reason. It's not because we are built in a different way or anything. It's often to do with social norms. For example, we know that after the earthquake in Nepal, over 50% of the fatalities were women, simply because they tend to stay at home, be in the kitchen, and when the earthquake struck, they were in the buildings that collapsed while their husbands may have been out at work. In Bangladesh, for example, in the 90s when a cyclone hit, we knew that girls couldn't necessarily do the same as boys did. For example, boys are being brought up to run around, climb on trees, and to swim. And girls are not brought up that way. Also, women have got a kind of, there's a social norm that women ask for the advice of their husbands. So what happened after the cyclone in Bangladesh is that the women were waiting at their houses to wait for their husbands, who never came, of course, because they may have died as well. And so they were stuck in their houses, not knowing what to do.
And another thing, I know that this hasn't necessarily happened in Sulawesi yet, but in other humanitarian crises that the DEC and its members have responded to, we see reports of how desperate people who've got nothing, sometimes it means that they're prone to being trafficked, and that they are recruited, that you know, unsavory people recruit children into prostitution. So can you tell me whether this is something that can happen in this situation, and what organisations like Save the Children do to prevent it from happening?
Yeah, so after disasters like this, the situation on the ground is really chaotic. You know, all the buildings have collapsed in the affected area. Children may have been separated from their families, either in the chaos of the event, or they may have been orphaned. So we've had a lot of reports of children turning up in hospitals alone. We've set up specific safe spaces for these unaccompanied children, for example, and we're working with local authorities to try and help trace their families or surviving members of their families where possible. But there's a myriad of risk that children and women and girls in particular are exposed to. This includes trafficking, sexual violence, and also early marriage. We just know that families are often so desperate to survive, because they would have lost everything, all their livelihoods, their houses. So there aren't the financial means to support their families, and that's why they often end up sending their girls to work. Sometimes they don't even know how dangerous their work might be. So they might be told by traffickers, oh yes, we're going to look after your daughter, she's going to work in a nice family abroad and she'll be able to send you money home. Well, that often isn't the case, and they end up in prostitution, for example. So families often don't even know the danger they're putting their children in. So yeah, it's really, they're just really desperate situations.
Yes. And so what do organisations like Save the Children do to mitigate the risk? I mean, you referred there to these places we call safe spaces or child-friendly spaces. Tell us more about what those are and how they work.
So child-friendly spaces are similar to nurseries here in the UK. They're just a really happy place for children to forget for a moment what they've been through, to just play with other children, to learn. We know that a lot of schools have collapsed, for example, and the education has been put on hold for the foreseeable future, just because there are no schools left. So we can provide children with education, but also more importantly, we can provide children with psychological support, because as I mentioned before, a lot of children have been through really distressing and traumatic experiences themselves. So this psychological support really will help them with their emotional well-being, and it's very important. And then for girls in particular, we often set up girl-specific friendly spaces, as is the case in Bangladesh, in the Rohingya camp in Cox's Bazar, for example, where only girls are allowed to attend, and this can be, for example, for religious reasons, when often their parents don't want them to mix with another gender. So in these spaces you only have girls, and we even have special wash and toilet facilities for them, so they can be safe and look after their hygiene in a safe way.
Yes, I mean, I in fact have been to see one of those girl-friendly spaces myself in the Rohingya camps in Bangladesh, and I am absolutely certain that no men or boys are allowed in that space, and the women patrol around the edge to make sure that absolutely no man can get in. I mean, so much so that when I went, I was only allowed to work with a female journalist and a female photographer, so that space is so fiercely protected, and it was truly wonderful to see those girls just happy and normal, and it was just so lovely. But Razmi, so teenage girls are affected in the same way, and then women more generally. So tell me, what sort of work does Plan do to help women? I mean, not only to receive the counselling and stuff that they need themselves to cope with the trauma, but also to make sure that they know what could happen to their own daughters.
So obviously, as Tammy was referring to, the ability to have closed group conversations allows us, obviously the child-friendly spaces attracts parents and women and mothers to be able to disseminate with them and to raise awareness and understanding, to build trust, and to really to disseminate those important messages around child protection and safety of family and children, which is obviously a priority to families in these contexts. So Plan in the same way works like Save the Children to put in those, put in the spaces and to do the training and to undertake building the capacity of local volunteers and those in the community who are sort of, well placed to support our interventions.
Thank you, Razmi. So now let's go back to Sulawesi itself. Monica, I've read reports in the media myself, as no doubt you have as well, that the Indonesian government has ordered foreign aid workers to leave Sulawesi. So can you explain whether the DEC and its members are affected by this order? Because after all, the British public are donating to our appeal and expecting that the money reaches the survivors of this terrible tragedy.
I think it's a very good question. It's a very legitimate concern to raise, given the reports we've seen in the media in the last few days. I mean, to start with, the DEC would never launch an appeal unless we know that our member charities and their partners on the ground have the access and the ability to respond. We know that so far 5 of our member charities are already registered as national entities on the ground. That includes Save the Children and Plan, who are here with us today. And the other 8 are registered as international NGOs in Indonesia, and they are working and delivering a response in Sulawesi through the support of local partners. So it's important to have this conversation within that context. Indeed, the government of Indonesia has issued a reminder to everyone in the country that no foreign NGOs are allowed to go directly to the field and that if they have deployed any foreign staff, they should recall them. But that is on the background of such requirement having already been there before, because the government of Indonesia wants to ensure that any new personnel going into the country or to the affected area works in collaboration and in coordination with the line ministries, and that all the aid is being delivered through local partners, those same local partners who were there from the very first day of the disaster striking. And as both my colleagues here would appreciate, this fits in very well with where the trends are going right now. All of the DEC member charities have made a commitment to the Localization Agenda, which basically means that we will continue to ensure that overseas aid is going to local partners, and that we continue to strengthen the capacity of local partners so that they themselves, as first responders, are as resilient as possible and prepared for future crises.
So, to give an example, Plan actually has a locally registered entity in country, and we've been working for some time to get to that level because of the concerns and the understanding around, you know, how to operate in that environment, which is clearly very complex. And our staff are all sort of regionally deployed. As I said earlier, we have our sort of head of disaster management in Jakarta, and it takes time to build the capacity and to support that localization. And there's absolutely no question that when a disaster strikes, it's the local agencies and the local communities that respond first. And that's through them that we build the resilience and the preparedness to sort of mitigate these disasters, because many of these disasters are cyclical and they will continue to happen, and they happen often in the same environments. So really understanding the context and the communities and the organisations we're working with.
And that makes complete sense. But just to be, 100% clear, there will be DEC members who had staff. Most of the staff in Indonesia will be Indonesian nationals, but there will have been people who are foreign working there already before this disaster happened, and those people are not being thrown out. Those people are working for registered charities there. Is that correct?
That is correct, and we know that, for example, the Red Cross Federation has international staff on the ground who were there before the disaster struck, and that they are there right now providing support. But to be honest with you, like we've always said, a response of this scale needs to be as local as possible, but also as necessary, as international as necessary. So if in this particular instance, colleagues from the ground will come to the realization that the scale of the needs is so big that they cannot cope. We are hopeful that they will have an open dialogue with the government of Indonesia, with UN agencies and others on the ground, to come up with more creative solutions and ensure that if they require physical technical assistance or advisory expertise, so on and so forth, that would be facilitated. But for now, we know that there is, while overstretched, there is capacity in Indonesia to respond to this crisis.
So one of the things we often talk about, moving on slightly, is that one of the wonderful things about the DEC is that the public will donate their money, and have been really generously over the past week. And we are, in fact, using that money as we speak. So, Monica, can you explain to us the difference between how the money is being used immediately for those immediate needs, and then what part of the money, do we save any for the longer term needs, and what does it go towards?
Sure. I mean, as in all such responses, the DEC funds are being used for the immediate life-saving activities that take place within the first few days, weeks and months of the response. We have a pre-agreed percentage of the funding that would be spent as soon as possible, and a minimum of 30% must be going to the immediate life-saving activities. But we have set up that percentage knowing that in such disasters there's always need for investment in recovery and reconstruction. So we would very much hope that from these very early stages of the response, member agencies, together with their local partners, are already setting the scene and starting work on rehabilitation work and on early recovery. And that could range from providing people with tools and seeds to start to keep the agricultural production going, to providing them with tools and perhaps boats in this particular instance, because we know a lot of the population around Palu used to get their daily food through fishing. We're likely to also see investments in the next few months into construction, building more permanent shelters, investments in reconnecting water pipes, so on and so forth. So while the investments right now and a lot of the DEC funding is going towards immediate life-saving activities, we need to ensure that some of the funding will be spent later on as well for those early recovery activities.
And just to talk a little bit more about one area there, I know that sometimes people, very much donors, want to see their money go to physical things. You know, they want to see it being spent on tarpaulin, ropes to build shelter, food, water. But there's another very important area which you touched on, Tamara, which is psychological support because of the trauma that they've suffered. But it's quite a hard thing to quantify. Can you talk about its importance in the response?
Well, we know that there is huge recognition within the sector that we need to invest in psychosocial activities, and we need to invest in protection, in particular, something that we've just talked about earlier, in particular in a context like this where people have suffered emotional trauma as well, or coming to terms with the loss not just of their livelihoods but also the loss of their family members. We need to be working with specific groups to help them come to terms with that loss and building the ability for them to move on with their lives. So investments as early as possible in psychosocial care, as well as in trauma counselling, so on and so forth, is fundamental. But there are other areas where, again, we cannot pinpoint specific delivery goods as such. So, for example, referral systems when it comes to health. We know that we have member agencies who are providing health support. That does not necessarily mean that we are buying something physical with our money, but we are investing in support, in expert support, to provide a very important function in helping that community recover.
Yes. Sorry, this is not to take away from the fact that the local government would already have disaster preparedness plans in place where they would have mapped out social services and health facilities, and it would have taken a bit of time for them to obviously resume services because they would have been affected too. And I think the imperative is to sort of like re-establish normality as much as possible, as quickly as possible.
That's very interesting. So one of the other things about how the DEC works, I think that's interesting, is that we only come together at times of great need, and all the members come together to collectively fundraise, and that is so that we can raise as much money as possible and be as efficient as possible. So on the ground, is it in fact more efficient, and does the money raised go further?
So PLAN is one of the 14 DEC member agencies, and I mean definitely, you know, the sense that we come together quite regularly, able to draw focus and visibility to the emergencies, you know, when they arise, and be able to sort of coordinate and network with each other means that we are certainly more efficient, and we share a lot of information. We try as much as possible. Monica and I see each other quite regularly, and you know, to steer that kind of a mapping and an understanding of how we can collaborate. And as I mentioned earlier, the needs are so great that whatever we can do to respond, it's probably, you know, it is necessary, but we need more. So it's mostly about avoiding duplication and really collaborating in partnership to achieve our aims in using the funding as efficiently as possible. And coming together means we can really, you know, raise funds in a way that we wouldn't if we did individually.
Yes, I mean, we certainly know that that part of the DEC model works. So getting down to real practicalities, does that mean that if your, you know, members are working in a certain part of Palu at the moment, that through working together we can get to the point where we can be sure that one family doesn't end up getting the same thing twice?
We certainly try our very best.
Yeah.
You know, obviously there will be overlaps, and we review our work. We have evaluations in our projects, and we take time out where there are coordination mechanisms on the ground, and what we call cluster meetings, where organisations come together around certain sectors to talk to each other about what they're doing and in which areas they're working, and share assessment data. So there's some very practical things that are already in place and tried and tested through emergencies. and for the large part we are successful, but there will always be, you know, margins of error.
Yeah. So Tamara, so this appeal we've had is for a natural disaster. It happened very suddenly, and it's one of the things that the DEC has always been able to respond to. Large-scale natural disasters happen very quickly. We turn our appeals around really quickly. But in fact, the three appeals two of the three appeals we had before that, we had for the Yemen conflict and the situation in East Africa. So quite a lot of appeals that are about longer-term conflict and complex situations. At the same time, we've seen a lot of hurricanes and extreme weather events happening around the world at the moment. So what do you think are going to be the cause of disasters in the future, and are things changing?
So Save the Children has been responding to more and more what we call protracted crises. So these are crises that are longer term, and it's also a myriad of crises within one crisis, if that makes sense. So for example, to use Yemen as an example, it started with a conflict, but the conflict caused a lot of other disasters within this conflict. So we've seen a cholera outbreak, for example, because sanitation facilities may have been destroyed through rockets and grenades, etc. We've also seen a spike in malnutrition amongst children. We know that millions of people are at the brink of famine in Yemen, for example. So these kind of myriad of risks form one big protracted crisis, and these crises are happening more and more. But then also with climate change, we've seen more and more natural disasters. I mean, this year, over the last few months, we've had numerous hurricanes, cyclones, flooding. India, in Kerala, a few weeks ago, we had severe flooding. We're going to see more and more rain today and tomorrow in India and Bangladesh as well, for example. So these things are increasingly happening, and it's very likely to do with the climate change.
But Monica, we can't have an appeal every 5 minutes. There's a lot going on. So what do we do to help communities ensure that they're prepared for these sorts of things?
I think there are a couple of things there, and just really to build on what we've heard right now, we are seeing more disasters caused by natural causes, as it were. But we're also seeing some of these disasters happening in middle-income countries and countries where the national governments are in a position to respond, and that is a growing trend. Now, obviously, even in those countries, as it is the case with Indonesia, should the government request support, or as is the case with Indonesia, welcome offers of international support, the spirit of solidarity should prevail, and the humanitarian imperative should always prevail, and we should continue to be ready to provide that assistance when it is needed. In some of the protracted crises where DEC funding has been spent, as I mentioned earlier, we invest not just in emergency relief and life-saving activities or early recovery, but we also invest in building the resilience of communities so that they themselves are better prepared when disaster strikes again. So a combination of preparedness and investment in preparedness and early warning and resilience building is fundamental, and something that the sector is doing whenever they respond to either a natural disaster or a slow onset protracted crisis. From DEC's perspective, we are always ready to help and always ready to mobilize our supporters here in the UK at times of large-scale need overseas, provided that member agencies are in a position to scale up and provide an efficient and effective response.
Well, thank you, ladies. So, yes, as Monica said there, we do rely on you, the people who support the DEC so generously to help us respond to these disasters. They're changing in nature and may becoming more frequent, and some of them are much more complex. But in the case of Sulawesi at the moment, it was a devastating earthquake and tsunami that struck the island, and you've all been so generous in helping us raise more than £13 million to date. So please do continue to donate generously. And I just wanted to thank Tamara from Save the Children, Monica from the DEC, and Razmi from Plan for joining me today. Thank you.